The violation notice taped to my front door at 3 in the afternoon looked official enough to give me a minor heart attack, right up until I read the reason for the fine. Unauthorized political signage on my property during a restricted period. I stared at the bright yellow poster board in my front yard that read, "Missing. Whiskers Orange Tabby Reward," and wondered what kind of insane person would think I was making a political statement about a cat. My name is Owen Norris, and I had been living in the Sunset Ridge subdivision in Gilbert, Arizona, for about 5 years. The community was one of those picture-perfect developments where every house looked like it belonged in a catalog, where the grass stayed green despite the desert heat, and where the HOA board apparently had nothing better to do than harass homeowners about non-existent problems. Whiskers had been missing for 3 days, and I was losing my mind with worry. I grabbed the violation notice and marched straight toward the community office, which was housed in a small building near the front entrance of our neighborhood. The Arizona sun beat down on my neck as I walked, making me sweat through my work shirt. I had just gotten home from my job at the electrical supply company when I found the notice, and I was not in the mood for bureaucratic nonsense. The community office was mercifully air-conditioned. Behind the reception desk sat Deborah Patterson, the HOA president, a woman in her mid-40s with the kind of severe bob haircut that screamed, "I would like to speak to your manager," before she even opened her mouth. She looked up from her computer with what I can only describe as practiced annoyance. "Mr. Norris," she said, drawing out my name like it tasted bad, "I assume you received your violation notice." "I did, and I need you to explain to me how a missing pet poster is political signage," I said, trying to keep my voice level. Deborah folded her hands on the desk in front of her with exaggerated patience. "The HOA covenants clearly state that no signage of any kind is permitted in front yards during the 60-day period before any local, state, or federal election. We are currently 43 days out from the special election for the school board, which makes your signs a violation." "It's a poster about my missing cat," I repeated slowly. "There's a picture of a cat on it. How is that political? The rules don't distinguish between types of signage," Deborah replied. "All signs are prohibited during the restriction period. You'll need to remove them immediately, or the fine will increase to $200 per day." I felt my jaw clench. "My cat has been missing since Monday. Every hour counts when you're trying to find a lost pet. You can't seriously expect me to take down posters that might help me find him." "I don't make the rules, Mr. Norris. I simply enforce them." Deborah turned back to her computer, clearly considering the conversation over. "Then I want to appeal this to the board," I said. She sighed dramatically. "The next board meeting is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. My cat could be dead in 3 weeks. He could be dead right now. I need to find him." "You're welcome to submit a written appeal, but the violation stands until the board reviews it," Deborah said without looking up from her screen. "Have a nice day, Mr. Norris." I walked out of that office angrier than I had been in years. When I got back to my house, I took photos of all 6 signs I had placed around the neighborhood, making sure the images clearly showed Whiskers' face and the word "missing" in bold letters. Then I posted the whole story on the neighborhood's Facebook group. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, I had over 100 comments from neighbors expressing outrage at the HOA's decision. Several people shared my posts to their own pages. A few mentioned that they had seen Whiskers around the neighborhood before he went missing and promised to keep an eye out. One neighbor, a woman named Sarah Chen who lived 2 streets over, commented that the HOA had done something similar to her when she put up a yard sale sign last year. My phone rang around 6 that evening. The caller ID showed it was my girlfriend, Zara Lawson. We had been dating for about 8 months, and she was out of town visiting her sister in San Diego. "I just saw your Facebook post," she said as soon as I answered. "Are they serious right now?" "Completely serious," I said. "Deborah actually stood there and told me that a picture of a cat is political signage." "That's insane. Have you heard anything about Whiskers?" I slumped onto my couch, suddenly feeling exhausted. "Nothing. I've walked the neighborhood every morning and evening since Tuesday. I've checked the shelters, called the vets, posted on every lost pet website I can find. It's like he vanished." "He's microchipped, right?" "Yeah, but that only helps if someone takes him to a vet or shelter to scan him. If he's hurt somewhere or if someone just decided to keep him." I couldn't finish that sentence. Zara was quiet for a moment. "I'm cutting my trip short. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon." "You don't have to do that. Owen, you're dealing with a missing cat and a psychotic HOA president." "Yes, I do have to come back. We'll figure this out together." After we hung up, I spent another hour walking the neighborhood, calling Whiskers' name and shaking his treat bag. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if I had been in any state to appreciate them. A few neighbors stopped me to ask about the cat and express their disgust with the HOA's actions. One older gentleman named Frank told me he had been fighting with Deborah Patterson for 2 years over the color of his mailbox. When I got back home, there was another notice on my door. This one informed me that I was now being fined $200 per day for each sign that remained in place. I had left all 6 signs up, which meant I was apparently racking up $1,200 in fines every 24 hours. The notice was dated today and signed by Deborah Patterson herself. I took a photo of that one too and posted it to Facebook. The comments section exploded. People were calling for Deborah's resignation. Someone suggested organizing a protest at the next HOA meeting. Another person recommended I contact the local news stations. That last suggestion actually seemed like a good idea. I had nothing to lose at this point, and maybe public pressure would force the HOA to back down. I spent the next hour drafting an email to every news station and newspaper in the Phoenix area, explaining the situation and attaching photos of the signs, the violation notices, and a picture of Whiskers looking particularly adorable on my couch. I sent the emails around 9 that evening and tried to get some sleep, but I kept waking up at every small sound, hoping to hear Whiskers meowing at the door. He had been an indoor cat primarily, but he liked to slip out occasionally to explore the backyard. On Monday, I had left the back door open while bringing in groceries, and he must have wandered out without me noticing. By the time I realized he was gone, it had been at least 2 hours. In a neighborhood that backed up to open desert, 2 hours was an eternity. Wednesday morning started with a call from a producer at Channel 12 News. Her name was Jennifer, and she sounded genuinely interested in the story. She asked if they could come out that afternoon to interview me and film the signs before the HOA forced me to remove them. I agreed immediately. The news crew arrived around 2 in the afternoon, just as Zara pulled into my driveway. She had made good time from San Diego, cutting what should have been a 6-hour drive down to just over 5. She hugged me tightly as soon as she got out of her car, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. The reporter was a polished woman in her 30s named Amanda Rodriguez. She had her cameraman film the signs from multiple angles while she interviewed me in my front yard. I explained the timeline of events, showed her the violation notices, and tried to keep my voice steady while talking about Whiskers. Zara stood just off camera, and I could see the concern in her eyes. "Have you considered just paying the fines to avoid the hassle?" Amanda asked. At $1,200 a day, I'd be bankrupt before the board meeting even happens, I said. Besides, it's the principle of the thing. These signs aren't political. They're not bothering anyone. They're trying to help me find my cat, and the HOA is more concerned about enforcing arbitrary rules than showing basic human compassion. Amanda nodded sympathetically. We've reached out to the HOA for comment. Miss Patterson declined to appear on camera, but sent a written statement saying that the association must enforce its covenants equally and without exception. She added that allowing one violation would open the door to others. After the interview wrapped up, Amanda told me the segment would air on the 5 o'clock news. Zara and I went inside, and she immediately started making a plan. She was a paralegal at a family law firm in Phoenix, and she had a much better understanding of legal issues than I did. First, we need to document everything, she said, pulling out her laptop. Every violation notice, every interaction with Deborah, every expense you've incurred trying to find Whiskers. Second, we need to review your HOA covenants and bylaws. There might be language in there that we can use to fight this. I retrieved my copy of the HOA documents from my filing cabinet. The thing was over 60 pages long, written in dense legal language that made my eyes glaze over. Zara started reading through it systematically, making notes as she went. Here, she said after about 20 minutes. Section 7, paragraph 3. It says that signage restrictions are intended to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics. It specifically mentions political signs, real estate signs, and commercial advertising. Pet-related signs aren't mentioned at all. So they're applying the political sign rules to something that isn't a political sign, I said. Exactly, and look at this part. The enforcement section says that the HOA board has discretion in determining violations and remedies. Discretion means they could choose not to fine you, but they're choosing to do it anyway. Before we could discuss it further, my phone started ringing off the hook. The news segment had aired, and apparently it had struck a nerve. Friends, family, and people I barely knew were calling and texting to express support. The Facebook post I had made earlier was being shared across the state. Someone had even started a hashtag, #FindWhiskers. The next call was from a lawyer named Richard Kim, who said he had seen the news segment and wanted to offer his services pro bono. He specialized in property law and HOA disputes, and he thought my case was a clear example of overreach and discriminatory enforcement. The thing about HOA covenants is that they have to be enforced uniformly, Richard explained when Zara and I met with him at his office the next morning. If the board is selectively enforcing this signage rule against you, but allowing other violations to slide, we can argue discrimination. Do you know of any other covenant violations in your neighborhood that haven't been addressed? I thought about it. Frank down the street mentioned his mailbox being the wrong color. He's been fighting with Deborah for 2 years, which means the violation has existed for 2 years without being resolved. There's also a house on Cedar Drive with a boat parked in the driveway. The covenants say no recreational vehicles in driveways, but that boat has been there for at least 6 months. Perfect, Richard said. We can use that. I'm going to draft a cease and desist letter to the HOA, demanding they rescind the fines and allow you to keep your signs up until your cat is found or a reasonable time period has passed. We'll cite selective enforcement and the fact that pet-related signage isn't explicitly covered under the political sign restrictions. What if they don't listen? Zara asked. Then we take them to court, Richard said simply. Most HOA disputes get settled before they reach that point, though. Once they realize you have competent legal representation, they usually back down. The letter went out that afternoon via certified mail and email. Richard also sent copies to every member of the HOA board, not just Deborah. He told me to continue documenting everything and to not take down the signs unless I was legally compelled to do so. Thursday afternoon brought more good news. The story had been picked up by a local news website, and from there, it had spread to social media platforms beyond just Facebook. People from across the country were commenting on the absurdity of the situation. Several animal rights organizations had reached out to offer support. A pet detective in Phoenix had volunteered to help search for Whiskers free of charge. The pet detective's name was Veronica Mills, and she arrived at my house Friday morning with specialized equipment including trail cameras, humane traps, and scent-attracting lures. She was in her 50s, weathered and competent, with the kind of practical energy that immediately put me at ease. "Indoor cat that got out?" she asked as she unloaded her equipment. "Yeah. He slipped out Monday afternoon. I've searched everywhere." "They usually don't go far," Veronica said. "Cats are territorial, and when they get scared, their instinct is to hide somewhere close by. We'll set up feeding stations with cameras at them in a grid pattern around your property. Most lost cats come out at night when it's quiet." She spent the next 3 hours setting up her equipment. Zara and I helped where we could, placing bowls of Whiskers' favorite food in strategic locations and positioning cameras to monitor them. Veronica also gave me a list of specific places to check: under decks, in storm drains, inside open garages, beneath cars. "The good news is you're doing everything right with the signs," Veronica said. "Visual awareness is crucial. The more people who know to look for him, the better your chances." "Unless the HOA makes me take them down," I muttered. Veronica had heard about that from the news. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, and I've heard a lot of stupid things in this job. You keep those signs up." Friday evening, I received a response from the HOA, not from Deborah directly, but from the board's attorney. The letter acknowledged receipt of Richard's cease and desist, but maintained that the HOA was within its rights to enforce the signage covenants as written. They reduced the daily fine from $1,200 to $300 total, not per sign, which they framed as a generous compromise. The sign still had to come down by Sunday evening, or they would proceed with legal action to compel removal and collect the accumulated fines. Richard called me after reviewing the letter. "They're scared," he said. "That fine reduction tells me they know their position is weak. They're trying to save face while backing away from the most egregious part of their enforcement." "But they still want the signs down," I said. "Let them try to enforce it. We'll file for an injunction on Monday if they push this any further. In the meantime, keep the signs up and keep looking for your cat." That night, I barely slept. I kept checking my phone for alerts from Veronica's cameras. Around 2 in the morning, one of them triggered. I pulled up the app she had given me access to and watched the footage. A cat appeared on the screen, approaching one of the food bowls. My heart leaped until I realized it wasn't Whiskers. This cat was gray and white, not orange. Still, it meant cats were in the area and using the corridors we had set up. Saturday morning brought a development I hadn't expected. Deborah Patterson called me directly, which was shocking enough that I almost didn't answer. When I did, her voice was clipped and hostile. "Mr. Norris, I'm calling to inform you that your campaign against the HOA has crossed a line. I've received over 300 emails, dozens of phone calls, and even had people show up at my home to harass me. This needs to stop." "I'm not campaigning against anyone," I said. "I posted about my situation on Facebook. I can't control what other people do with that information." "You deliberately painted the HOA in a negative light to gain sympathy," Deborah said. You've damaged the reputation of this community and my personal reputation in the process. I'm exploring legal options for defamation. I felt my temper flare. Everything I posted was factual. You did issue those violations. You are trying to fine me for signs about my missing cat. If the truth makes you look bad, that's not defamation. That's just bad behavior being exposed. The signs come down by tomorrow evening, Mr. Norris. I won't tell you again. She hung up before I could respond. I immediately called Richard and told him about the conversation. He asked me to write down everything I remembered about it while it was still fresh. He also warned me that Deborah's mention of defamation was almost certainly an empty threat meant to intimidate me. People throw around the word defamation a lot, Richard said. Actually proving it in court is nearly impossible, especially when everything you've said is true and documented. She's rattled and she's making mistakes. That's good for us. Saturday afternoon, Zara and I walked the neighborhood again, this time with flyers to hand out to anyone we encountered. We must have talked to 50 people over the course of 3 hours. Most were sympathetic and promised to keep an eye out for Whiskers. A few mentioned that they had also had run-ins with Deborah over various HOA issues. One man named Travis said that Deborah had fined him $500 for leaving his trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup. He had been at work and couldn't move them until he got home, but the HOA didn't care about his circumstances. She's on a power trip, Travis said. Has been since she got elected president 3 years ago. A bunch of us have been talking about organizing to vote her out at the next election, but she's good at dividing people so they can't build a coalition against her. When's the next election? I asked. January. Still 4 months away. That evening, one of Veronica's cameras caught another cat, and this time my heart stopped completely. The image was grainy because it was dark, but I could see orange fur and white paws. It looked like Whiskers. I called Veronica immediately, and she was at my house within 30 minutes. That's a good sign, she said, reviewing the footage. If that's him, he's staying close to home, which is exactly what we want. I'm going to set up a humane trap at that location tonight. If he comes back for food, we'll have him by morning. We positioned the trap carefully, baiting it with an entire can of tuna and some of Whiskers' favorite toys to make it smell familiar. Veronica showed me how to monitor it remotely through the camera system. Then there was nothing to do but wait. I couldn't sleep at all that night. I kept the camera feed open on my phone, watching for any movement. Around 4 in the morning, something triggered the motion sensor. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and watched the screen. An orange cat approached the trap, sniffed around the entrance, and then backed away without going inside. "Come on," I whispered at the screen. "It's okay, just go in." But the cat disappeared into the darkness without returning. I felt crushed. I was so sure we would have him back by morning, and instead, I was right back where I started. Zara woke up next to me and asked if there was any news. I just shook my head. Sunday morning arrived with more bad news. Another violation notice appeared on my door. This one informing me that the HOA would be filing for a court order to compel removal of the signs, and that they would be seeking reimbursement for their legal fees in addition to the accumulated fines. The total amount they claimed I owed was now $4,500. I photographed the notice and sent it to Richard. He responded within an hour, saying he would file our injunction first thing Monday morning. He also said that the HOA's aggressive escalation would work in our favor because it demonstrated their lack of reasonableness and good faith. Zara spent most of Sunday fielding messages from reporters. The story had continued to spread, and now national outlets were picking it up as an example of HOA overreach. A producer from a morning talk show in New York had reached out, asking if I would be willing to do a phone interview. I agreed, figuring that more publicity might pressure the HOA to back down. That afternoon, I noticed something strange. There were more yard signs appearing throughout the neighborhood. Not political signs or missing pet signs, but messages of support. We support Owen, and find Whiskers, and Deborah must go. At least 20 houses had put up signs by evening. I hadn't asked anyone to do this, but apparently the community had decided to take action on their own. I was both touched and worried. Touched because it showed that people cared. Worried because I knew Deborah would find a way to blame me for it and escalate even further. Sure enough, around 6 that evening, I received a call from another board member named Tom Hendricks. He sounded exhausted. "Owen, I wanted to reach out personally," he said. "I'm not calling in any official capacity. This is just neighbor to neighbor. You need to understand that Deborah is absolutely livid about the signs that have gone up today. She's talking about issuing violations to every single house that has one." "I didn't ask anyone to put up signs," I said. "I know you didn't. I believe you, but Deborah doesn't see it that way. She thinks you're orchestrating some kind of rebellion against the board." "Tom, I just want to find my cat. That's all I've ever wanted. If Deborah would stop hassling me about some imaginary political violation and let me look for my pet in peace, none of this would have happened." Tom sighed. "Between you and me, I voted against issuing that first violation. So did 2 other board members. But Deborah insisted, and she's very good at getting her way. I'm sorry this has blown up the way it has. I'm going to push for an emergency board meeting tomorrow to address this before it gets any worse." "I appreciate that," I said. After we hung up, I felt a small glimmer of hope. If 3 out of 5 board members had opposed the initial violation, maybe there was a chance for a reasonable resolution. But that hope was tempered by the knowledge that Deborah clearly held significant influence over the board's actions, despite not having majority support. Monday morning, Richard filed our injunction in Maricopa County Superior Court. The filing requested that the court prevent the HOA from enforcing the signage violation until the matter could be properly litigated. Richard argued that the HOA's interpretation of its own covenants was overly broad, that enforcement was selective and discriminatory, and that I would suffer irreparable harm if forced to remove signs that were crucial to finding my lost pet. The local news coverage intensified. By noon, my story was trending on Twitter. A national cable news network had picked it up as a segment about HOA abuse. My phone was ringing constantly with interview requests, messages of support, and tips from people who thought they might have seen Whiskers. I tried to follow up on every tip, but most turned out to be other orange cats in the area. The emergency HOA board meeting Tom had mentioned was scheduled for 7 that evening. It would be held at the community clubhouse, and homeowners were invited to attend. Zara and I arrived 15 minutes early, and the parking lot was already packed. The meeting room could hold maybe 75 people comfortably, and there were easily over 100 residents trying to get in. Deborah sat at a table at the front of the room with the 4 other board members. She looked composed but tense, her hands folded in front of her in that same practiced way I remembered from our first confrontation. Tom Hendricks sat at the far end of the table, deliberately not making eye contact with Deborah. The other 3 board members looked uncomfortable. The meeting started with standard HOA business, approving the minutes from the last meeting and discussing the budget for landscaping maintenance. The crowd grew restless quickly. Finally, Deborah addressed what everyone actually came to discuss. "I'm aware that there has been significant controversy regarding the enforcement of our signage covenants," she began. I want to make it clear that the board takes its responsibility seriously. Our community has thrived because we maintain high standards and enforce our rules consistently. Then why is Frank's mailbox still the wrong color after 2 years? Someone shouted from the crowd. Deborah's jaw tightened. We're not here to discuss every individual enforcement matter. We're here to address the specific situation regarding Mr. Norris and the unauthorized signs on his property and others. You mean the signs about his missing cat? Another voice called out. The room erupted in supportive murmurs. Deborah raised her hand for silence, but it took a full minute for the crowd to settle down. The covenants are clear about signage during election periods, Deborah continued. Mr. Norris was given multiple opportunities to comply voluntarily before fines were assessed. His decision to involve the media and create this circus has only made the situation worse. I stood up, my hands shaking slightly. Can I respond to that? Tom Hendricks nodded before Deborah could object. I made my way to the front of the room, very aware that everyone was watching me. First, I want to thank everyone who has supported me through this, I said. Second, I need to make something clear. I didn't set out to create any kind of controversy. My cat went missing. I put up signs, like thousands of people do every day when they lose a pet. The HOA decided to interpret those signs as political and issue violations. Everything that has happened since then is a direct result of that initial decision. The covenants don't distinguish between types of signs, Deborah interrupted. They say no signs during election periods. Period. I turned to face her directly. Actually, the covenants specifically mention political signs, real estate signs, and commercial advertising. Pet-related signs aren't mentioned. You made a choice to interpret the rules in the broadest possible way, without any consideration for the circumstances or common sense. The crowd applauded. Deborah's face flushed red. This is exactly the kind of grandstanding that has made this situation untenable, she said. You're not interested in following the rules. You just want to do whatever you want and make the HOA look bad when we try to stop you. I want to find my cat, I said, my voice rising. That's all I've ever wanted. If you had an ounce of compassion, you would have worked with me instead of against me. But you'd rather power trip over yard signs than show basic human decency. The room exploded in applause and shouts. Tom Hendricks called for order, but it was chaos. Deborah stood up abruptly, gathering her papers. I'm not going to sit here and be attacked, she announced. This meeting is adjourned. You can't adjourn the meeting unilaterally, Tom said. We need a vote. I'm the president and I'm adjourning it, Deborah said. She walked out of the room, leaving the other 4 board members sitting there looking stunned. Tom took charge. Okay, let's try to restore some order here. Deborah may have left, but the rest of the board is still present. I move that we vote to rescind the violations issued to Owen Norris regarding his pet-related signage. I second, said another board member, a woman named Patricia. The vote was 4-0 in favor with Deborah absent. The room erupted in cheers. Tom explained that they would send me official documentation of the board's decision, and that all fines would be forgiven. He also apologized on behalf of the board for the way the situation had been handled. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. I still didn't have Whiskers back. The signs could stay up, which was great, but they didn't do any good if my cat was hurt or worse somewhere I couldn't find him. Zara hugged me as we left the meeting. At least that's one problem solved, she said. Yeah, I agreed, but my heart wasn't in it. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound outside, hoping to hear a familiar meow. Nothing came. I checked Veronica's camera feeds obsessively, but there was no sign of the orange cat from before. Tuesday morning brought a surprise. Veronica called me at 7, her voice excited. "I'm at your house," she said. "I caught something in the trap, but I don't want to check it without you here. Can you come home?" I was already at work, but I told my boss there was an emergency and drove home faster than I probably should have. When I pulled into my driveway, Veronica was standing next to the trap, which was covered with a cloth. I could hear sounds coming from inside. "Is it him?" I asked, not daring to hope. Only one way to find out. I knelt down next to the trap, my hands shaking as I pulled back the cloth. Inside, huddled in the corner looking scared and dirty but very much alive, was Whiskers. He meowed when he saw me, a pitiful, frightened sound that broke my heart and filled it with joy at the same time. "Hey, buddy," I said, my voice cracking. "Let's get you home." Veronica showed me how to safely transfer him from the trap to a cat carrier I had brought. Whiskers didn't fight it. He seemed too exhausted to resist. I could see that he had lost weight, and there was a small cut on his ear, but otherwise, he appeared okay. I took him directly to the vet for a full checkup. Dr. Sarah Park examined him thoroughly and said he was dehydrated and malnourished, but had no serious injuries. The cut on his ear was superficial and already beginning to heal. She gave him fluids and some medications, and told me to keep him inside for the next few weeks to recover and prevent another escape. "You're a lucky cat," Dr. Park told Whiskers as she finished her exam. "Your dad went through a lot of trouble to find you." When I got home, I set up Whiskers in the bathroom with food, water, and his litter box. Veronica had recommended confining him to a small space initially to help him feel secure after his ordeal. He ate ravenously, then curled up in a towel and fell asleep. I stood there watching him sleep, feeling emotions I couldn't fully articulate. Relief, definitely. Exhaustion, gratitude, and anger still at how much harder this whole process had been made by the HOA's interference. Zara arrived around lunchtime, having taken the afternoon off work. She was thrilled to see Whiskers back safely. We sat in the bathroom together, just watching him sleep, both of us needing the reassurance that he was really home. "What are you going to do about Deborah?" Zara asked after a while. "What do you mean?" She walked out of that meeting. "She tried to fine you thousands of dollars over nothing. She needs to face consequences for that." I hadn't really thought about it. My focus had been entirely on finding Whiskers, but now that he was back, I realized Zara had a point. The way Deborah had handled this wasn't just bad judgment. It was vindictive and abusive. "I don't know," I admitted. "The board voted to rescind the violations. What else can I do?" "You can make sure she doesn't do this to someone else," Zara said. "People like her don't stop unless they're forced to." Over the next few days, I learned more about Deborah's pattern of behavior as HOA president. Multiple neighbors reached out to share their stories. Frank with the mailbox had been dealing with harassment for 2 years. A woman named Kelly had been fined for having decorative stones in her front yard that were supposedly the wrong color. Another family had been threatened with legal action over a play structure in their backyard that was barely visible from the street. The list went on. Richard suggested that I could file a complaint with Arizona's Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOA operations in the state. If there was a pattern of abuse or violation of state HOA laws, the department could investigate and potentially take action. I spent a week compiling documentation. My own violation notices and communications with Deborah, testimony from other homeowners who had been targeted, and evidence of selective enforcement throughout the community. The file I submitted to the department was over 40 pages long. In the meantime, Whiskers was recovering well. He had regained most of the weight he'd lost, and his energy was coming back. I had reinforced all the doors and windows in my house to make sure he couldn't escape again. He seemed content to stay inside, as if his adventure had been enough excitement for one lifetime. About 3 weeks after the board meeting, Tom Hendricks called me. The board had held another meeting, this time with proper notice and procedure, and had voted to remove Deborah Patterson as president. She would remain on the board as a regular member for the remainder of her term, but she would no longer have executive authority. Tom had been elected as the new president. "I wanted you to know that we're also reviewing all of our enforcement policies," Tom said. "We're going to create a formal appeals process and add language to our procedures about taking individual circumstances into account. What happened to you shouldn't happen to anyone else." "I appreciate that," I said. "Really." "There's one more thing," Tom added. "Deborah filed a personal lawsuit against you for defamation. I wanted to give you a heads up before you receive the papers." I felt my stomach drop. "She's actually doing that. Her attorney filed it yesterday." "I'm sorry, Owen. The board doesn't support this, but we can't stop her from taking personal legal action." After we hung up, I called Richard immediately. He was unsurprised by the news. "I've been expecting this," he said. "She's backed into a corner and lashing out. Don't worry, we'll handle it. Everything you said about her was true and documented. This lawsuit isn't going anywhere." The defamation papers arrived 2 days later. Deborah was suing me for $100,000 in damages, claiming that my Facebook posts and media interviews had damaged her reputation and caused her emotional distress. She alleged that I had deliberately painted her in a false light and incited harassment against her. Richard filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that truth is an absolute defense to defamation, and that nothing I had said about Deborah was false or misleading. He also filed a counterclaim for malicious prosecution, arguing that Deborah's lawsuit was filed in bad faith and solely intended to harass and intimidate me. The legal process dragged on for months. Discovery, depositions, motions, and counter-motions. Richard handled most of it, but I still had to spend hours reviewing documents and preparing testimony. It was exhausting and stressful, but I had no choice but to see it through. During this time, the Arizona Department of Real Estate completed their investigation into the Sunset Ridge HOA. Their report, which was made public in November, found multiple violations of state HOA laws. These included failure to provide proper notice for meetings, inconsistent enforcement of covenants, improper assessment of fines, and lack of adequate appeals procedures. The department issued a formal letter of reprimand and required the HOA to implement corrective measures within 90 days. Deborah's name was mentioned specifically in the report multiple times. While the department couldn't take action against her personally, the report's findings significantly undermined her defamation case. How could she claim her reputation was damaged by my truthful statements when a state agency had independently confirmed that her conduct was problematic? The defamation case finally went before a judge in January. Richard presented our motion to dismiss, walking through each statement I had made about Deborah and showing how every single one was supported by documentary evidence or protected opinion. He also presented evidence of other homeowners who had experienced similar treatment, demonstrating that my experience was not unique and therefore unlikely to be false. Deborah's attorney struggled to identify any specific statement I had made that was both false and defamatory. The best he could do was argue that my tone had been accusatory and that I had encouraged others to harass his client. But Richard pointed out that I had never called for anyone to contact Deborah directly and couldn't be held responsible for how others chose to respond to my story. The judge took 2 weeks to issue his ruling. When it came, it was a complete victory. The defamation case was dismissed with prejudice, meaning Deborah couldn't refile it. The judge also awarded attorney's fees to me, finding that the lawsuit had been frivolous and filed primarily to harass. The total amount Deborah would have to pay was just over $15,000. Richard called me with the news on a Friday afternoon. I was at home and Whiskers was asleep on my lap. Zara was in the kitchen making dinner. "It's over," Richard said. "You won. Completely and totally." I felt tears prick my eyes. The stress of the past several months hit me all at once, and suddenly, I was crying. Zara heard me from the kitchen and came running, and I had to explain through sobs that these were happy tears. The following week, there was one more development. The Arizona Department of Real Estate announced that they were expanding their investigation based on additional complaints they had received. Apparently, my case had encouraged other HOA victims throughout the state to come forward with their own stories. The department was looking into whether there needed to be stronger oversight of HOA operations and whether current laws provided adequate protection for homeowners. A reporter from the Arizona Republic called me for comment. I told her that I hoped my experience would lead to meaningful change that would protect other homeowners from similar abuse. "All I wanted was to find my cat," I said. The fact that such a simple, human thing turned into this massive legal battle shows how broken the system is. No one should have to go through what I went through just to exercise their basic rights. The article ran the next Sunday as a front-page feature in the local news section. It traced my story from beginning to end and included interviews with other HOA victims, legal experts, and state legislators who were considering reforms to HOA laws. In February, Deborah Patterson resigned from the HOA board entirely. No official reason was given, but rumor had it that her employer had grown tired of the negative publicity associated with her name. Tom Hendricks remained as president, and the board held a special election to fill Deborah's vacant seat. A retired teacher named Gloria won in a landslide, running on a platform of common sense enforcement and treating homeowners with respect. The HOA settled with me formally in March, issuing a written apology and reimbursing me for all expenses related to finding Whiskers and defending against their enforcement actions. The total came to just over $8,000. They also amended the community covenants to explicitly allow temporary signage related to lost pets, regardless of election periods. Richard's fees were covered by the judgment against Deborah, so I didn't have to pay anything out of pocket for legal representation. I tried to take him out to dinner as a thank you, but he insisted that seeing justice done was payment enough. We compromised on drinks. Life slowly returned to normal. Whiskers remained an indoor cat, and I made sure to be extra careful about doors and windows. He seemed perfectly content with this arrangement, spending his days sleeping in sunbeams and his evenings demanding attention. Zara and I got engaged in April. She proposed to me, actually, which was very her style. We were hiking in the Superstition Mountains, and she just pulled out a ring and asked if I wanted to marry her. I said yes before she even finished the question. We planned a small wedding for the following fall. Nothing fancy, just close friends and family in my backyard. The HOA didn't give us any trouble about it, which was a relief. In June, the Arizona legislature passed new HOA reform laws. The legislation included stronger protections for homeowners facing enforcement actions, mandatory appeals processes, limits on fines, and increased transparency requirements for HOA operations. Governor Katie Hobbs signed the bill in a public ceremony, and I was invited to attend. She mentioned my case specifically in her remarks as an example of why the reforms were necessary. No Arizonan should have to fight their HOA just to look for a lost pet, she said. These reforms will help ensure that HOA boards exercise their authority reasonably and with appropriate oversight. I shook her hand afterward and thanked her for prioritizing the issue. She told me that my willingness to speak out had made a real difference. The story had a strange epilogue in August. I received a letter in the mail from Deborah Patterson. Not legal correspondence, just a personal letter, handwritten on plain stationery. It was brief. Mr. Norris, I owe you an apology. I handled your situation poorly from the beginning, and I allowed my ego and stubbornness to turn a simple matter into a major conflict. I was wrong. I'm sorry for the stress and expense I caused you. I'm glad you found your cat. Sincerely, Deborah Patterson. I showed the letter to Zara. She read it twice, then set it down on the kitchen counter. How do you feel about that? She asked. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to believe she's genuinely sorry. Part of me thinks this is just her trying to rehabilitate her image. Can it be both? Maybe. I guess it doesn't really matter. What's done is done. I wrote back a brief response, thanking her for the apology and saying that I hoped she had learned from the experience. I didn't try to be friends with her or excuse what she had done, but I also didn't see the point in holding a grudge. She had faced consequences for her actions. That was enough. Zara and I got married in September under a perfect Arizona sky. Whiskers was technically the ring bearer, though in practice, he was more interested in napping in the shade than participating in the ceremony. Our friends and family filled the backyard, and everyone had a great time. During the reception, my friend Marcus made a toast. To Owen and Zara, he said, raising his glass. May your marriage involve far fewer HOA disputes than your engagement did. Everyone laughed, including me. It was funny because it was true. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, I sat on my back porch with Zara and Whiskers. The neighborhood was quiet, lights twinkling from houses up and down the street. Somewhere nearby, someone was probably having their own battle with their HOA over something equally ridiculous. That was just the nature of these communities, but I had survived mine. More than that, I had fought back and won, and in doing so had helped change the system to protect others. My yard signs for a missing cat had turned into a referendum on HOA power and accountability. It wasn't what I had set out to do, but I was proud of the result. Whiskers purred in my lap, completely oblivious to the journey his disappearance had set in motion. He was just happy to be home, safe and loved. In the end, that was what the whole thing had been about. Not politics or property values or covenant enforcement. Just love. The love of a pet owner for his cat, and the lengths he would go to bring that cat home safely. The yard signs were long gone now, replaced by flower beds that Zara had planted. But I kept one of the original signs, the first one I had put up when Whiskers first went missing. It was in my garage, folded carefully and stored in a box with the violation notices and legal documents and newspaper clippings. A reminder of what I had been through and what I had overcome. Sometimes I would take it out and look at it. The bright yellow poster board, Whiskers' face printed in the center, the word missing in bold black letters. It seemed so simple, so innocent. How could anyone have looked at that and seen a political statement? But I knew the answer. It wasn't about the sign at all. It was about power and control, and a person who had forgotten that her job was to serve the community, not rule over it. Deborah Patterson had turned my personal crisis into a battleground because she could, because she thought no one would stop her, because she had gotten away with similar behavior for years. She had been wrong. and the system that enabled her had been forced to change. Not perfectly and not completely, but enough to matter. Enough to help the next person who found themselves in my position. That was something worth fighting for. It was worth the stress, the expense, the months of uncertainty. Because at the end of it all, justice had prevailed. The good guys had won, and Whiskers was home where he belonged. I put the sign back in its box and closed the garage door. Inside the house, Zara was cleaning up from the wedding, humming to herself. I could hear our guests' laughter still echoing in my memory. Life was good. Life was exactly as it should be. And if the HOA ever tried to give me trouble again, well, I knew exactly who to call and exactly what to do. But somehow, I didn't think that would be a problem anymore. Tom Hendricks had proven to be a reasonable and fair president, and the new board was committed to working with homeowners rather than against them. The culture had shifted. As I walked back into my house, I passed the spot where my front door used to bear violation notices. Now it just had a wreath that Zara had hung. No yellow papers, no threats, no fines. Just home. Whiskers meowed at me from his perch on the couch, demanding attention. I sat down next to him and scratched behind his ears, feeling the rumble of his purr through my fingertips. He had no idea what he had put me through. No concept of the legal battles and media coverage and legislative reforms that his brief adventure had triggered. But that was okay. He didn't need to understand. He just needed to be here, alive and safe and loved. Everything else was just details.